Hello friends, my name's Kenny and welcome to our daily chronological Bible study commentary. Today we'll be in Genesis 41 and 42. It's day 26 of our study, and if you haven't read Genesis 41 and 42, I want to recommend that you stop for a second and go and read that and then come back and restart the video. I won't be going over everything in detail, so you'll need to kind of know what the story is in order for this to make sense. Now, our passage in chapters 41 and 42 begins with Joseph in jail and waiting for whatever God is going to do. He's just there in the jail waiting. And it starts with Pharaoh having a couple of dreams. He has dreams about these fat cows coming out of the Nile, and they're eating, and then some skinny cows come out of the Nile and they eat the fat cows, but they don't get any fatter. And then he has another dream about crops that's very similar. And so he's sharing this with his advisors, and they can't interpret the dream. And at that time, the cupbearer, who Joseph has successfully interpreted a dream for 2 years earlier, mentions to Pharaoh that this guy who can interpret dreams is in prison. Pharaoh calls him up, and Joseph successfully interprets his dreams, and to say that there's a famine coming. In the process of that, Pharaoh recognizes the wisdom of Joseph and puts him in charge of Egypt. Now, this sets the stage for the real focus of this story, and that is Joseph's interaction with his brothers and his reunification with his family. Remember, Joseph got sold into slavery by his jealous older brothers a few chapters ago. As a slave, he came to Egypt. He wound up being sold to Potiphar. Potiphar's wife attacked him sexually, and he rejected her advances. She accused him of rape or attempted rape, and he wound up in prison for that. Now, he's been in prison for several years, and now he's standing in front of Pharaoh interpreting these dreams. In that process, Pharaoh recognizes the wisdom of Joseph and puts Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. Joseph literally goes from being a prisoner to the number 2 in charge of all of Egypt, with all the authority of Pharaoh, including his signet ring that he would use to sign his name with, that Pharaoh would use. So Joseph has all this power all of a sudden. But in this portion of the story, there's one thing that's really important for us to recognize, and that's the humility of Joseph. Joseph had this incredible gift given to him by God to be able to interpret these dreams that God had given. And whereas most dreams are random thoughts in the night, when God gives a specific dream, Joseph was able to interpret it. And so when Joseph interpreted the dream, or was asked to by Pharaoh, his answer to Pharaoh was very clear. He said, "I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh his answer." Joseph recognized that this was a gift from God. It wasn't of him. It was something different. And that's a big lesson for us to learn. That when we have a gift or a talent that blesses others, it is not there because we just sort of automatically have it. It's there because God has given it to us in order to bless others. So it's very important that we utilize those things. And Joseph used that for Pharaoh, utilized it with Pharaoh to interpret his dreams. Now, Pharaoh recognizes the wisdom of Joseph, that God's hands on him, and that he's got the wisdom to help Egypt through what's coming. Now, Pharaoh's dreams pointed out that there was going to be a 7 years of great harvest in Egypt, and then 7 years of famine. And so Joseph planned to take all the extra harvest and put it in storehouses so it would be ready for the 7 years of famine. And so Pharaoh thinks Joseph is wise and puts him in charge of all of Egypt. Now, as it would be, this famine extended far beyond the region of Egypt. It extended into Canaan, where Joseph's family lived. So, as they ran out of food and they began to get hungry, Jacob, Joseph's father, sent his sons down to Egypt. And this is where the real adventure begins. He sends his sons down to Egypt in order to buy food. And Joseph, who now looks Egyptian, he's already been there for something like 13 years. He's has his head shaved. It seems like that says so from Scripture. He looks like an Egyptian. He's speaking Egyptian. He sees his own brothers who sold him into slavery show up and ask him for food. Now, they don't recognize him. He's speaking Egyptian. He's grown up. He looks completely different. And so he puts them through all kinds of tests. I won't give you all the details of that. You'll see those in Scripture. But he puts them through all kinds of tests, the end of which is his whole family winds up coming to Egypt. Now that happens because after 2 rounds of them coming to get food and him sending them home and them coming to get food and Joseph trying to kind of manipulate them to get all of his family there to Egypt, Joseph reveals himself. And we see in this moment when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, the beginning of a very important scripture principle, and that is the principle of forgiveness, the necessity to forgive and to reconcile relationships. Jesus came to reconcile our relationship with God. And so Joseph in this story is reconciling his relationships with his brothers. And in the story, Joseph is more representative, more of a representation of God, and his brothers are the representation of the sinners. And Joseph reached out to his brothers and accepted them in spite of what they had done to him, just like God accepts us in spite of our sin. So it's this great parallel to what God does in the lives of believers. And so as the story continues to unfold, God demonstrates his faithfulness to Joseph and to Egypt because of Joseph. And the story comes to an end with Joseph and his brothers and his father living there this section comes to an end with everyone living there in Egypt prospering. Joseph's family is now safe from the famine. They have some of the best land in Egypt in the eastern part of the Nile Delta and what's in the region that Pharaoh would take. And they are prospering and growing. And so we see God's faithfulness all throughout this chapter 41 and 42. So as you go in and you read it and you take a look at it and you think about it, remember, God was faithful to Joseph. And God was faithful to Pharaoh and blessed everyone around him through Joseph's faithfulness. So God will be faithful to you. So I love you guys. Thank you for watching today's episode. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow as we continue to study the scripture together. We'll see you later. Bye.